Grubstake War, a classic Western adventure. Call all out, called the foreman of the grading outfit, as he stood on a little eminence overlooking the laboring teams in the long railroad cut. Instantly, the trained mules stopped in their tracks, some with scrapers half filled, others with scrapers half dumped, and answered the welcome call with a prolonged bray. Hurriedly, the dust-covered, sweating teamsters unhitched their teams and rushed away to the nearby construction camp. There, they washed their faces in tepid water that had been hauled from the nearest water hole in a wooden tank and prepared for the noonday meal of beef, beans, and coffee. It was only April, but already the sun was bearing down like August. Hot puffs of dust-laden wind came up from the great desert that lay to the south. The snow-caps on distant mountains aggravated the mind, without relieving the bodily discomfort of the men who were building a railroad through the heart of Arizona to connect two great transcontinental lines. Rip Campbell raised the water from one of the battered basins on a long bench and dashed it over his sun-browned face and neck. Then, when he had dried his face and hands, he picked up a twisted piece of brush and beat the white dust out of the folds of his sweat-stained shirt before going into the mess tent. By 100 little acts, all of which Rip seemed trying to hide, he showed that he was with but not of the miscellaneous crowd required for frontier railroad building. The fact was, Rip Campbell was a gentleman. Not by special training for the part, not because of his lineage, though it was good enough, but naturally born a gentleman. A man who, even when he fought, and he sometimes had to fight, did it in a gentlemanly, fair, clean manner. Rip was nearly 6 feet, broad of shoulder, and his sober gray eyes looked out straight from beneath heavy sandy brows. A thatch of crispy, reddish-brown hair, lightened by alkali dust and the lack of a barber's attention, covered a well-shaped head. The sun and dust and wind, together with a naturally good-humored disposition, had put little nests of permanent wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Just now, there was a look of seriousness in Rip's gray eyes as he avoided the jam and rush of men going into the tent and waited quietly until he could enter like the gentleman he was. The reason for the serious look was that Rip was about to undertake an adventure of which he could see only the beginning and couldn't even guess the end. He was quitting the construction company for 2 reasons. One was that if he stayed on the job, he would have to whip Jack Bradley. That, indeed, would have been a rather pleasant task if it had been merely a matter between him and Bradley, for Jack needed a trimming. But Mr. Bradley owned 3 teams which he worked on the grade, hiring his own teamsters. Rip knew they'd gang on him, and he also knew he wasn't rough enough for the other men to take his part. The main reason for his quitting, however, was that he had been working steadily on the job for more than a year. It was a dog's life to him, and he'd had enough. Besides that, he had been thinking. People would come in with the railroad. They would have to eat. A few irrigated acres of land would be a fortune, and he was going to look for land and water that could be gotten together. He would need no engineer to tell him that water would run downhill. He was an engineer himself. That was what he had come west for. He had found that engineers, like officers in an army, were fairly plentiful, but privates were always in demand, so he had worked in rock cuts, driven teams on grade work, and served a general apprenticeship at railroad building. Now that he had learned the trade, he was quitting to try something else. Rip wasn't the kind of fellow who would throw down his tools and quit in the middle of the day. He was 28 and thoughtful for his age. He always wanted to be fair. The 8-hour day hadn't been born at that time, so it was almost dark when the day's work done. Rip Campbell went to the foreman's tent to get his time. As Rip entered the tent, he met a man coming out. The stranger was a tall, slender, sharp-featured man wearing a long-tailed coat. He greeted Rip with a nod as they met and passed on. A few minutes later, when Rip came out, placing his paycheck in his pocket, he saw the stranger sitting on a boulder a little way from the tent. "I'd like to talk to you a minute, partner," said the man and motioned to a seat on the stone by his side. Rip had never become fully accustomed to the Western custom of being perfectly at home with strangers. He knew there were men who followed the construction camps for the purpose of gambling with the men. This man was clad very much like an itinerant gambler, but he hadn't the right expression in his face. "Quitting the outfit?" asked the stranger, as Rip took the proffered seat. "Yes. Don't blame you. It's pretty rough. Going back to civilization?" "No. Thought I'd just stick around and help civilize this country," replied Rip. "Oh, I see. Joining up with the Rangers, I reckon." "Wrong again," laughed Rip. "I'm no fighting man. Fact is, I'm still a little bit afraid of the West. I'm going to look for some land that I can put water on and grow things for all these new people to eat. I have an idea." "And it's a good one, too," interrupted the stranger. "I wanted to do that, but—" The man coughed, and they sat in silence for a full minute. "Marshall is my name, John Marshall," he then went on. "I'm up against it, hard, and I want to talk to a man that can understand things. I believe you're that kind, and I want to tell you my troubles. It won't hurt you, and maybe it'll help me." "Go ahead," nodded Rip. "My name's Rip Berry, and I have nothing to do until morning. Then I'm going down to Badger Hole, at the end of the track, draw my pay, and look about a bit." "Don't be a long story," Marshall answered. "A year ago, the doctors told me to get a wagon and team, come out to this dry country, and rough it. I did, and I seem to be getting better, but I found out that a man can't keep traveling about without money. I got the same idea about farming by irrigation that you have. I found the place, too, and could have bought the claim for a song, but by that time I couldn't sing a note. I was broke, and looking for something that I could do, to eat. I came down here, thinking I might work my team a while on the grade, but it's no go. I began to cough when I got in a mile of this dust. Then I gave up, decided to sell my wagon and team for enough to take me back to the old home, where I can at least be buried like a Christian." The man stopped and hung his head in a despondent manner. "Did you sell your team?" asked Rip. "No. That's what I was doing in the foreman's tent. He said the outfit wouldn't buy horses at any price because they couldn't stand the work. If I had mules, he might buy them. The wagon, he wouldn't have." "That's hard luck," commented Rip, in a sympathetic tone. "Yes. I've got a good outfit. The horses are Missouri stock. Been out here a year and are acclimated. They're only 6 years old, and the wagon was new when I started. A fella that runs some teams on this job, name's Bradley, offered me $75 for the 2 horses, if I could get rid of the wagon. FD take it, but that wouldn't get me back to Phoenix, by stage, and buy me a ticket home, to say nothing of anything to eat." Rip pondered the problem a minute before he spoke. "If I had enough money, I'd buy your outfit," he said then. "I might raise enough, but there'd be none left for a grubstake." "It wouldn't take much to buy it," said Marshall, with a gleam of hope in his sunken eyes. "You could go up on Little Bowlegs, then, and get that claim I told you about. There's about 100 acres that can be put underwater, and there's an ocean of water in Little Bowlegs. Plenty of good pasture land adjoining it, and nobody would ever crowd in because there's no more farm land on the creek. Just the place you're looking for. I wouldn't tell you, but I can't have it myself. Come, go down to my camp, and look at the outfit," and Marshall rose from his seat on the boulder. Rip joined him, and they walked away together. The stranger had described the very thing that Rip had been dreaming of for months. He had more than enough money to buy the outfit at a reasonable, fair price, but not enough to do that and have any operating capital left. There must be money to pay the shiftless squat or something for the claim and to go on until a crop could be raised. True, he might grind this poor, sick, broken-hearted wanderer down, buy his team for a pittance, and get by that way. He knew that was one way men got rich in this world, but his decent character revolted at the thought. As they walked away through the camp, a man got up from behind a great boulder, within 20 feet of where they had been sitting, and went into the foreman's tent. It was Jack Bradley. A quarter of a mile from the construction camp, they came to Marshall's wagon and the 2 great, raw-boned bay horses. Rip looked the horses over the best he could in the fading light, caught the spokes of a wagon wheel and shook it to see how badly the thimbles were worn, and then sat down on the wagon tongue and lit his pipe. A scheme was hatching in his mind, but he wanted Marshall to talk more before he decided. "Hasn't the climate done you any good?" he asked, between puffs at his pipe. "As long as I could stay up in the foothills, like the Bowlegs country, I seemed to mend, but as soon as I come down where the alkali dust is, it's all off." "Wouldn't you like to go back up there?" "I'd rather be there than anywhere on earth, but I can't live on climate and scenery. Buy my outfit, at your own price. Then go up there and make a fortune. I'd rather have that little irrigated farm than to have any mining proposition in the territory. I'd like to try a lot of things on it that I learned in my 4 years in college. Botany, horticulture, and agriculture were hobbies of mine." R.I.P. smoked in silence. Buying horses from strangers in Arizona at that time was a doubtful enterprise. They might be good horses, but the buyer might also be called on by a party of enraged citizens, who knew but one remedy for horse stealing and carried it with them, coiled at a saddle horn. Marshall didn't look like a thief, nor did he talk like a receiver of stolen goods. Still, Rip was cautious. "I won't buy your team," he said at last. "Oh, for pity's sake, man," cried Marshall, with almost a sob in his voice. "I'll take any price you say. I can't work and I don't want to starve. This West they tell about is a great place, and the people are all right. The proportion of good and bad is about the same as in other places, except in railroad camps, but the West is too busy to take care of cripples. It's a fight, out here. A real, He-Man's job. Oh, I don't know. I've seen some cripples make a pretty good fight, in my time. Using your head in a fight cuts a good deal of ice sometimes. I'm going to make a proposition to you, by which I can't lose and you can eat. You'll know I'm all right, or I wouldn't make the offer, and I'll know your game, if you take me up on it. Good enough. Let's have it. I'll go up to the bunk tent, get my gear, and put it in your wagon. Then we'll get a little sleep. About 4 o'clock, while it's cool, we'll head out for Badger Hole. When we get there, I'll draw my money, Grubstake the outfit against your wagon and team, and we'll prospect Little Bowlegs together, share and share alike. That's fair. More than I ever hoped for, cried Marshall, grasping Rip's hand. I didn't want to be a quitter. With a partner like you, I'll stick it out and get well yet. So were friendships made in the Old West, between men driven together by hard necessity. They might, apparently, have little in common, but such friendships often lasted until death. Many a time men have stood with a dead partner at their feet, fighting on, more to avenge the death of a friend, than to protect themselves. Such became the friendship between these two men. It was 40 miles from the construction camp to the claim on Little Bowlegs, 25 miles from the camp to the end of the track at Badger Hole, and 40 miles from Badger Hole to the Little Bowlegs country, thus making an isosceles triangle, with a 25-mile base and the claim on Little Bowlegs at the apex. 3 days later, the wagon, well stocked with supplies and grain for the team, the partners topped a rise, and Marshall, who was driving, stopped. "Yonder," said he, "is Bowlegs Creek. There are two of them, Big Bowlegs and Little Bowlegs. Big Bowlegs is dry, except when it rains, which isn't often. Little Bowlegs has a flood of water, from head springs, all the time. You see that the two streams head almost together, curve out like a parenthesis and come together again. It looks like a bow-legged giant, lying on his back, his head in the mountains, his feet together in the edge of the plain, and a ridge of foothills between his knees. That's what the creeks took their name from. This trail crosses just below where the two creeks come together. Half a mile below that point, the water sinks into the sand and disappears. Below that, Bowlegs is a dry gorge, except when there's a waterspout, and then it's a terror." "Looks quiet and peaceful up there," commented Rip. "Yes. Only the one squatter in all that country, far as I know, and he's anxious to get away. There's no water between here and the crossing on Bowlegs, so we've got to make it there tonight," and Marshall urged the team on. "Peaceful. Oh, yes. Bowlegs looked peaceful enough, but one old-timer said, 'Yep, you can grow crops awful quick on this Arizona land, if you put water on it.' Plumb astonishing, but more astonishing is how quick men can raise hell on it, without no water at all." It was quite dark when, winding through the thick timber that grew along the banks of Bowlegs Creek, the partners heard the welcome music of the gurgling, rushing stream. "Hello," said Marshall. "There's a campfire just this side of the creek. Wonder what's up now?" They made camp at a little distance from the other and started a fire. Pretty soon, the other wayfarer came over to their camp. "Hello, fiddler. Glad to see you," cried the visitor, and extended his hand to Marshall. Why, how are you, Mr. Mosby?" returned Marshall, grasping his hand. "Make yourself comfortable, and we'll have some supper pretty soon. This is my partner, Mr. Barry." Mosby acknowledged the introduction. "Much obliged, but I don't," he said. "I'd like to hear you fiddle some after supper, though." Marshall and Rip went on with their cooking, but Rip was wondering just a little about this acquaintance of Marshall's, in a country where there was supposed to be but one man. Marshall was doing some thinking himself. He was wondering how the owner of that coveted claim and Little Bowlegs came to be camping here below the forks, and presently he asked the question. "Oh," said Mosby, as he squatted on his heels and smoked his old pipe, "I done sold out my claim on Little Bowlegs. Made the trade yesterday." "To whom?" asked Marshall with a note of disappointment in his voice. "Fellow named Bradley. Said he'd been running some teams on the new railroad. Traded me a pretty good mule, to match the one I had, and load I could get work down there." "I'm sorry," said Marshall. "We were on our way up to give you a trade for that claim." "Shucks. You don't want that little old place. I stung that feller Bradley good when I traded it to him. There's only 100 acres of farmland. 'Sides that, there's a trick in it that I didn't tell you. It lays pretty, there in the bend, and looks like moving about 4 shovels of dirt would put water all over it, and it would, just about. What's the trick, then? Gravel subsoil and cracks in the rocks underneath that lets the water all out, and Mosby went on to tell the faults of a property he had sold, as men often do, but, unlike many others, he was telling the truth. "Is there any other farmland farther up Bowlegs?" asked Rip. "Not on Little Bowlegs. There ain't a patch of dirt that a dog could bet on, from my old place to the head of the creek, just a lot of canyons and crevices and rocks, where a earthquake or something has plumb busted things sometime." The partners finished their cooking and fell to with hearty appetites and the silence that usually attended eating on the frontier. Mr. Mosby's jaws were not otherwise employed, so he went on talking. "If you fellows want some real good land, you'd ought go up Big Bowlegs. There's 200 or 300 acres up there. Red clay subsoil, good, deep loam, and she lays plumb pretty for water, except they ain't a dang drop of water, only when it rains. Old Gray Hoss Riley's up there, or was, last time I seen him. He's been there 5 years, and raised one good crop." Mosby rattled on until the partners finished eating. Afterward, Marshall got out his violin and blended its music with that of the gurgling stream. He was a dreamer and a rare musician. Next morning the partners were awakened by the rattle of Mosby's wagon, as he broke camp a little after daylight. "I don't like to give this Bowlegs project up," said Marshall, after breakfast. "If Mosby told the truth, Bradley will be wanting to sell pretty soon. Suppose we take a little trip up Big Bowlegs and get the lay of the country. No use trying to trade with Bradley now." "Might as well, now that we're here," replied Rip. "T don't want to see Jack Bradley. There's pretty apt to be trouble whenever and wherever we meet. He's a good man, I reckon, but I can't get along with him." They hitched up the team and took the dim road that led up Big Bowlegs. 10 miles from their camp, they emerged from the boulder-strewn wilderness into a beautiful valley, walled about with foothills. The creek ran almost due south from the mountains, and the valley lay on the east side of it. As Mosby said, there was 200 or 300 acres of fine land, but no water. There were 2 cabins in sight, and a wreath of smoke was curling from the chimney of one. Old Gray Hoss Riley was standing in the door of the first cabin they came to, and the old gray bag of bones that gave him his name was grazing the stunted bunch grass near the cabin. "Morning, gents," called the old hobgoblin, as the wagon stopped, his tobacco-stained whiskers bobbing up and down and giving the appearance of an ancient billy goat. "Prospecting, I reckon," he went on, when they had returned his greeting. "Thought we might locate a claim in this section, if we could find a good one," ventured Rip. "Ain't but 3 claims in 20 miles that's worth the filing fee, and they're all took. Mosby's got one on Little Bowlegs, and I got 2 here on Big Bowlegs. His claim ain't worth a copper-line dam. Nothing but water over there. Lends no account. How's this land of yours?" "Best land east of the range. Don't seem to be much growing on it." "Too early yet. Get our rains mostly in May and June." "Would you sell these claims?" "No, siree. Just suit me to a T." Marshall made a movement as if to start the team. "Hold on, partner. Don't hurry. I might sell that one up there that the other cabin's on. I reckon one's all I need. I'll take $1,000 for it, and I'll give you 100 for a quitclaim deed," said Rip. Anybody but a pair of easy marks would have known Mr. Riley for what he was, a cold-blooded old reprobate, who would rob his grandmother's grave for a penny. He swore and protested that the offer was an insult, but within an hour he had $100, which was more than he would have given for the whole of Arizona, and the partners had a quitclaim deed, written by Marshall and duly signed, together with the original papers issued by the land office. This title wasn't much as it stood, but if they made certain payments and did certain things within a specified time, it would be perfect. They took possession of the cabin, and Marshall began to figure. He was figuring 40 bales of alfalfa to the load, and a ready market at $1.50 a bale, at the railroad. He took no account of the fact that when the railroad was built, alfalfa would be shipped in cheaper than that. In the midst of his figuring, while Rip was silently trying to figure out why he bought the claim, old Gray Hoss hobbled up to the cabin. "Howdy, gents. Been thinking about these claims. You'd oughter have one apiece. I'm getting old, and I'd sell out entire, if I got the right offer." Now, Rip was putting up the money for the enterprise and had been wondering why he had paid 100 for a dry claim, where it never rained. Neither of the partners spoke. "Tell you what I'll do," Mr. Riley went on. "You seem a likely pair of youngsters, that's apt to make something of this valley. I'm too old to work it. I'll sell you the other claim for another 100. "No," said Rip, "if it's any good, One claim is enough. If it isn't any good, one claim is too much. But Mr. Riley was no quitter. When he had set his hand to the plow, he came down to 75, then to 50, and finally offered to take a Winchester rifle and $25 and leave the valley. More for the riddance than for the land, Rip made the trade. Soon after noon, Mr. Riley packed his most intimate belongings on the old gray plug and disappeared into the roughs at the south end of the valley. He had bumped 2 suckers, and it was not the first time he had done the like with those same 2 claims. In his 2 years in the West, Rip Campbell had seen very few safe deposit vaults, except the mountains, where nature had deposited her gold and silver and copper and had apparently thrown away the key. By tacit agreement, he was head of the firm, so he took all the papers in the land deal, folded them carefully, and placed them in his pocketbook. He noticed that the papers from the land office, on which the quitclaim deeds were based, had been much handled, and on one of them, there was a splotch that looked like dried blood. He paid it no attention. So the papers reposed in the old leather pocketbook, which Rip always carried on his person. Rip wasn't crazy, by any means. He was an engineer. He saw at a glance that with very little labor a dam could be built just above the upper cabin, and storm water enough stored to irrigate considerable land. As soon as Riley was out of sight, he picked up the remaining rifle, told Marshall he was going to take a look farther up the gorge, and left the cabin. It was little more than a mile from the cabin to the head of the creek, but owing to the curve it couldn't be seen. Rip took his way up the gorge, scanning the ground with a critical eye. A little way up the stream he came upon pools of water, with lush grass and weeds growing along the banks. Half a mile from the cabin, the gorge became a crevasse, with towering walls of stone, and the stream a tiny ripple over the stone bed. By this time, he could see that the gorge ended, apparently, in the side of a mountain, with no way out, except the way he had come in. He went on and came upon an immense blue pool of water under the overhanging cliffs. 100 feet above him, a tiny stream came over the precipice. It looked like a silver rope that unraveled as it came on until it was a broad tassel of spray by the time it struck the pool and cast a tiny rainbow on the dark blue water. He was spellbound with the beauty of the thing. As he stood, looking in wonder, there was a great roar of water, seemingly all around him. At last, he tore himself away from the beauty spot, searched out a way, and climbed the bluff on the east side of the creek. At the top of the bluff, he walked around to where the little stream broke over the cliff, then stopped and caught his breath. The roaring water was not far to seek. About 100 feet to the west of where he stood was the head of Little Bowlegs. A flood of pure, clear water was pouring through a deep, wide crevasse in the solid stone of the mountains. The tiny stream that flowed into Big Bowlegs was simply overflow from a low place in the stone banks that ran through an age-worn channel to the cliff. From where he stood, Rip could see his own valley and could see that it was far wider and lower than that of Little Bowlegs. At that point, the head of Little Bowlegs was a straight, stone channel for several hundred feet, as if nature had labored it for 1,000,000 years, or some titan had chiseled an immense chute in the stone. The water was level with the top, and sweeping by with the speed of a railroad train. Rip turned from it and started to find the source. He had gone but a little way when climbing onto a ledge of stone he saw for the first time, the basin spring. It was 100 feet across, and boiling and bubbling like an immense pot. He crept to the edge of the spring and gingerly put his finger in the flood. It was icy cold. The melting snow of the mountains was finding its way to the sea through crevices and grottos. Rip glanced up, and then started as he saw a woman standing on the other side of the basin. She was looking at him, but if she was speaking, he couldn't hear her for the rumble of the water. A little way beyond the woman was a cabin. There was a climbing rose by the cabin door, and just above the house, watered by a smaller spring, was a little garden patch and some green alfalfa. Here and there were bright spots where some homely flower bloomed. Walking around the rim, Rip crossed a brawling little stream that came from above the garden and emptied into the basin. The woman didn't run away. She didn't seem the least frightened or embarrassed. Just surprised. She was a young woman, little more than a girl, and she was pretty. Rip said, "Good evening." The girl's teeth flashed white between red lips as she returned his greeting. Do you?" and Rip stuck. "Yes," laughed the girl. "Strange as it may seem, I do. I live in that cabin, with my father. Won't you come and see him?" Rip would, and he did. On the way to the cabin, he told the young woman his name was Rip Berry, and she told him her name was Jessie Tatum. How else could they be introduced? There was no one else to do it. That part of the West was not very well up on conventionalities. The house was 2 big rooms, with a little lean-to at one side. Flowers were growing in every nook and cranny about the place. There was some homelike, Gripping thing about this solitary cabin, lost here in the mountains, that Barry couldn't explain to himself just then. When they entered the cabin, the visitor saw a long-haired, bushy-whiskered old man, sitting by a window, fingering some bits of broken quartz. "This is my father, Mr. Tatum, Mr. Barry," introduced Jessie. "Glad to meet you, sir," and the old man extended a gnarled and knotted hand. "Knew a Jim Barry, at Placer City. Any relation of yours?" "Why, I haven't figured, but, that is, I don't know, sir." "Yes," said Tatum, a little later, "I've been prospecting here in these mountains, for 20 years or more. Everybody on the range knows old Rance Tatum. Most of 'em knows I got a cabin on the head of Bowlegs, but mighty few have ever seen it. How'd you find it? Prospecting?" "No, sir," replied Rip. "I bought some claims down on Big Bowlegs." "Claims? Claims? Why you got flimflammed? There's no mining down there." "Claims of land," explained Rip. "Oh, squatters' claims. Why, they ain't worth a whoop. Why didn't you take up that little pocket of land down on Little Bowlegs? Plenty of water to irrigate that. Can't raise anything here without water. I was on a trade for that, but another fellow beat me to it." "What? Another fellow? What's his name? Know him?" "Yes, sir, I know him. Jack Bradley is his name." "Huh. This country is getting too thick settled for me. Don't mind having one neighbor, but if they get too thick, don't matter on Bowlegs, though. I've prospected both branches, clean to the mouth, and never got color. Now, I struck a little pocket, over on the west prong of Hellroarin' Creek, in '72 I reckon it was, and—" "Father, did you know the alfalfa was ready to cut again?" interrupted Jessie. "Reckon it is. Now, there's something that'll show you what good dirt and water will do in this country, Mr. Barry. 4 years ago we built this cabin here at the Basin Spring. Nothing would do, Jessie, but we must have a garden patch. It raises all the fruit and vegetables we want, and enough alfalfa to feed my saddle mule, Jessie's pony, and 2 burros. Why, back in '72, or maybe it was the next year, I struck a little pocket over on—" "Maybe Mr. Barry would like to see the garden, father," interrupted Jessie, again. "Yes, I expect he would," and reaching for his cane, Rance Tatum rose and hobbled to the door. "I limp pretty bad yet," the old fellow said, as they went toward the miniature farm, "but I'm getting better all the time. Pretty soon I will be able to make another round. I was up the range a ways last year, or maybe it was the year before, and fell and busted my leg. Minded me of the time I struck that little pocket, back in—" "Father, tell Mr. Barry how many times we cut this alfalfa in a year." Diverted from his little pocket again, Tatum told Rip about the hay, and the fruit and vegetables that Jessie grew on the little plot of ground. "Yes, sir, it is wonderful what will grow on land in this country if you give it water, but Jessie's the farmer," he concluded. "I'm a prospector. Back in '73, or maybe it was '74, I struck a little pock. There's at least another acre of good land here, Mr. Barry," said Jessie, again preventing her father from explaining about that little pocket, "but I can't get the water on it. It looks slower than the other, but the water won't run that way." "Well, now I haven't figured, but if I had my instrument here I could fix it for you," Rip said. "Oh, could you?" "Yes, ma'am. All you have to do is find out which way is downhill and let the water run that way. If you want, I'll bring up my instrument and figure it for you." "I'd be so glad. That would make me quite a farm." That was the beginning of their acquaintance. Rip stayed an hour, and at Jessie's invitation promised to come the next day and show her which way was downhill. Old Rance Tatum had tried a dozen times to tell about that little pocket on the west prong of Hellroarin' Creek, but every time Jessie would interrupt him. The facts were that old Rance had been out on a prospecting trip 3 years before. Jessie had been with him. The old fellow had fallen off a bluff and had broken about everything that was breakable, knocking a dent in his head for good measure. Throughout his fight back to life, he muttered about that little pocket on the west prong. He got up again, but was crippled for life, and now he only sat by the window looking at his pieces of quartz and muttering to himself about this pocket. Perfectly rational when roused out of his reverie, but when he had talked a few moments intelligently he would slip a cog and go back to that pocket. Rip looked again at the mammoth spring and speculated on how much, or rather how little, labor would be required to turn a sufficient amount of that great volume of water into his valley, to irrigate all the farmland he and his partner had. It was the heart of a primitive wilderness. Doubtless this was the first time a trained eye ever had studied the possibilities of the spring as an irrigation project. Reaching the bed of the gorge by a perilous climb, Rip gave one hurried glance at the beautiful silver rope, which he meant to enlarge until he could climb by it to fortune, and subconsciously he was thinking of a wonderful woman. "Rip Berry," he muttered to himself, "you're just about the luckiest man in the world. Lucky in coming to Arizona, in the first place, lucky in meeting up with John Marshall, lucky that Jack Bradley beat you to the claim on Little Bowlegs, lucky that you bought out both of Riley's claims, and, just lucky every way, that's all," and he whistled a merry tune as he hurried on down the gorge. It was almost sunset when he got inside of the cabin. He could see only one of the horses, and Marshall was not in sight. He sensed something wrong and quickened his pace. He found his partner bound and gagged, on the dirt floor of the cabin. There was a frightful lump on his head, where he had been struck a heavy blow, and he was groaning with pain. "Who did this?" demanded Rip. "I don't know," replied Marshall weakly. "After you left, I lay down to take a little nap. When I woke, or rather when I came to, I was bound and gagged and my head was bursting." Rip forgot the wonderful story of luck that he was going to tell his partner. The first thought that came to his mind, as he removed the gag and unbound Marshall's hands even before Marshall had spoken, was that Jack Bradley was at the bottom of this outrage. Rip, like most good-natured, fair-minded men, was a terror when he was mad, and he was good and mad now. There was plenty of room in that country for the few people in it, without crowding, and he didn't mean to be crowded. Jack Bradley had found out, in some way, and had come into the Bowleg country to beat him out of a claim. He had succeeded and ought to be satisfied. As soon as Marshall was a little better, Rip dug into a pack and got out an old Colt's .45. He strapped it on, grimly. "Seems like you have to fight for what you get in this country, same as anywhere else," he said. "I didn't want to fight, but if nothing else will do, I'm in." Marshall tottered over to a battered old grip, and hauled out an old hogleg. He strapped it on, dragged it from the holster, and spun the cylinder awkwardly. It was a piece of comedy to watch him, and Rip laughed outright. "Oh, I know it's a joke, Rip, but, I'll do my best to shoot the next fellow that, oh, hell. I'm not fit for the frontier. Let's hitch up and get out of here." "Hitch up what? Didn't you know one of the horses was gone?" "No." "Well, it's true, and I've been wondering why they didn't take both. Looks like I know why. Nobody on earth but me can catch old Selim when he's turned loose. I turn them loose to graze. Well, here we are. I might put the saddle on Selim and try to track the thief down, but it would be foolish. I don't know the country. The thief has got 4 or 5 hours start. Guess we'll have to let him go, for the present." Rip knew Jack Bradley was a bully and a gambler, but never thought of him before as an out-and-out thief. The thoroughness with which the marauder had gone through their effects, after putting Marshall out, didn't escape Rip. There was evidence, also, that Marshall's pockets had been gone through, but not a thing was missing. This puzzled Rip, but he made no mention of it to his partner, who apparently had troubles enough. They ate supper, tied Selim to the wagon, right at the cabin door, where they could watch him, then sat smoking in silence. Finally, Marshall broke out railing at himself for getting them into a mess. "Oh, cut that out," growled Rip. "I'm the one that caused it all, by making an enemy of Jack Bradley, but I never did know how he came to hate me so. Don't blame yourself. You're hurt worse than I am. You've lost a horse and got a cracked head. I've only lost a couple of $100, and that ain't lost yet, I don't think." The last words Rip spoke, as they went to bed, were, "I'm going to sleep with one eye open, and if anybody fools around this cabin before morning, I'll do my best to keep him with us." It was past midnight, and the waning moon had risen, when they both woke and sprang up to listen. The pounding hoofs of a running horse came thundering up the valley. They drew their guns and stood tensely waiting. Grim determination was on their faces. Neither of them had ever been in a gunfight, but they were willing to try. The lone horse galloped into view, a length of frayed rope flying at its neck. It was Selim's mate, come home. "Good," cried Rip. "Now we are whole again, except your cracked head." "And that'll heal," said Marshall, as he secured a rope and tied up the returning horse. "I won't go to sleep at the switch again." "Marshall," said Rip, next morning after breakfast, "there's no use trying to fool ourselves about this thing. We're up against trouble. Somebody, I don't know who it is, doesn't want us to have these claims. If you say the word, we'll pull up and leave." "If I say the word, do you want to quit?" "Not any. I never wanted to do anything as much as I want to stick on and fight this thing out." "Talk sense, then," said Marshall. I wouldn't live more than 15 minutes anywhere else, and I'd get more pleasure out of taking one shot at the gent that cracked me over the head than I could ever get in any other way. Let's take the balance of our stuff out of the wagon and go to housekeeping right." That afternoon, Rip fished his transit out of his kit of surveyor's instruments and told Marshall he wanted to group the gorge again and take some levels. "Go ahead," coughed Marshall. "I haven't got wind enough to go with you, but I've got good eyes and I won't be caught asleep again." After finding Marshall bound and gagged, Rip didn't mention his discovery at the head of the gorge. He'd take some levels and make sure that he could do what looked so easy before he told his partner about it. Back at the Tatum cottage, Rip set up his instrument, ostensibly to do a bit of engineering for Jessie Tatum. He could have handled her problem by simply looking at the ground. An hour's work with the pick and shovel, and he had water on the little plot of ground. Incidentally, he had found out something he wanted to know about the stone that lay between the basin spring and the bluff where his silver rope hung over. "I don't know how I can ever repay you for putting the water on the balance of my little farm," said Jessie Tatum, as he was about to take his leave. "I'll take part of the vegetables that grow on it," grinned Rip. "Oh, shame on me. Why didn't I think to offer you some vegetables? There are plenty here. Take what you like." "Not this time," he said. "This old transit is load enough. There's something that I would like to have, though." "And that is?" "Permission to turn some of the water from the basin spring into Big Bowlegs so I can irrigate my land. Turn it all in there if you want to. It's below my farm. Can you do it?" "I don't know how I can ever repay in a week or two, and I can tell you then." Jessie Tatum, the prospector's daughter, watched Rip's broad shoulders until they went out of sight over the bluff. There was an odd light in her brown eyes. She was wondering if he really could turn that flood of water onto his land. Certainly, he could, she told herself. A man like that could do anything. There was another thought, still back of that in her mind, as she turned to where old Rance was mumbling over his bits of quartz at the cabin door. Rip found Marshall undisturbed. On his former return from the Tatum cabin, his story had been held back by the condition in which he had found his partner. Now there was another cause, just pure jealousy. He would not have admitted it, didn't even know it, in fact, but subconsciously, he was telling himself that he had found this wonderful woman and didn't want her to meet this polished, affable John Marshall with his music until, that was as far as his mind went. It refused to set a date for the meeting. Only once had he been a bit suspicious of this partner whom he had picked up in a moment at the construction camp. That was when they met Mosby, and he found that the two men were acquainted. "We've got to go down to the nearest land office in the morning," announced Rip, as they sat smoking after supper. "I want to be sure of our title to these claims." "Think they're worth the trouble, with no water on them?" asked Marshall. "Yes. I think we can put water on them, with a little work, but I won't do the work for someone else." The following morning, they loaded their effects into the wagon and left at daylight. Rip made the mental note that it looked as if they were abandoning their claims and wondered what Bradley's next move would be. It was 50 miles to the nearest land office. Arrived there, it was discovered that the documents were all regular. The payment of nominal fees for the recording of the papers and going through certain forms perfected the title to the two claims, one in the name of Rip Campbell and the other in the name of John Marshall. "Now let Bradley crack his whip," said Rip, as they left the land office. "That land is ours, to have and to hold, etc." "I'm afraid I've let you in for a lot of trouble," said Marshall, in a doubtful tone. "Trouble? You've let me in for a fortune and the only life worth living." "You're an enthusiastic farmer," smiled Marshall. He didn't know that there was more than the promise of green fields, back there on Bowlegs. About noon, on the fourth day, their wagon, now heavily laden, and containing, among other things, some bags of alfalfa and other seeds, rattled into the valley on Big Bowlegs. Rip had feared Bradley would burn the cabins in their absence. The valley was just as it had been when they first entered it. Even old gray hoss Riley was standing in the door of the first cabin, and the old gray bag of bones was cropping the dry bunch grass. "Morning, gents," greeted Gray Hoss. "I've been on a little prospecting trip over east a ways. I dripped in here last night about dark, to see how you fellows make out in your new home. Don't see nobody around, so I stays all night in the cabin. Where you all been?" "Down to the railroad to get some bacon and flour," replied Rip. No effort was made by either of the partners to detain Mr. Riley, and he soon left, going down Big Bowlegs, just as he had done on that first day when they had bought him out. "Wonder what that old devil is hanging around here for," growled Rip, when Riley was out of hearing. "Oh, he's just a shiftless old prospector," replied Marshall. "The mountains are full of them. They're no good to themselves or anyone else. The 125 you paid him has made him rich. He'll go on hunting a fortune now, until his money is gone. Then he'll freeze to death in a blizzard or starve in the desert. Most of them are half crazy." Rip thought of old Rance Tatum but didn't mention him. "Well, Mr. Riley is one prospector that I can get along without," he said, instead. "I've got a hunch that he's acquainted with Jack Bradley. Our title to these claims is good, and I mean to stay here. If he comes snooping around here again, I'm going to find out why." A little way above the upper cabin, which the partners had selected as their home, a natural dam lay across the creek. It looked as if, at some time, nature had hurled down part of a mountain, and the seamed stone had landed across the gorge. Their water supply came from what was supposed to be a spring, at the upper end of the long pool formed by the dam. That is, at the upper end of what would have been a deep pool, a quarter of a mile long, had there been any water in it. The partners drove the wagon around the end of the dam and on toward the spring, which Rip knew was nothing but the water from his silver rope, and which trickled down the gorge under the gravel that covered the solid stone floor. "Must have been 10 years since it rained in this country," commented Marshall, "or there'd be water in that place." "Fish are in it," replied Rip. "That's what those 10 bags of cement are for. Nature has done just about everything for us, up here. All we have to do is put on a few finishing touches, and we'll have a paradise." On high ground, near the spring, a good part of their load was unloaded, beneath some bushes, and covered up. "I feel better," said Rip, as the wagon rattled back down to the cabin. "I know what dynamite will do, and I don't enjoy riding on a load of it." Back at the cabin, they unloaded a plow, hose, shovels, bags of seeds, and miscellaneous supplies. "Now we're all set," cried Rip, as he wiped the sweat from his face. "Can you plow, Marshall?" "I think so. I never plowed much, but I have a general working knowledge of the business," and Marshall smiled in his whiskers. "I don't mean to be bossy," said Rip, "but the job of stopping the fissure in the dam and turning water from that spring I found is too hard for you. If you'll keep house and plow a little on both claims, just to show our good faith as homesteaders, I'll work at the water problem." "Fine. You're the boss, Rip. If it hadn't been for you, I'd either have starved to death or else I'd be back at the old home, broke, coughing away the little time left me, with everybody pitying me and at the same time wishing I was out of the way. I'd rather be dead. Yes, I'll plow what I can. You go right ahead and boss the job." 2 weeks passed. Rip was off by daylight every morning and returned at dark. Marshall saw the white, limey drill dust on Rip's overalls and knew he was preparing to blast some stone, but he asked no questions. He, too, was busy. He had plowed a considerable patch of land on the upper claim, and enough on the lower one to show good intentions. Every day, these 2 weeks, Rip had eaten a good dinner of fresh vegetables, wholesome bread, and meat and coffee at the Tatum cabin, while old Rance's dog spurned the lunch he invariably carried. He felt ashamed of not telling Marshall what was at the head of the gorge, but he just couldn't do it. He was willing to work for his sick partner and to divide everything else with him, but Jessie Tatum was a different matter. Every day, Jessie Tatum watched from the cabin door as Rip drove the long chum drill into the soft stone barrier that lay between him and a fortune, and he began to hope. True, she knew nothing about him, but conventions must be dispensed with on the frontier. He knew nothing about her, except that her father was a half-mad old prospector, but that made no difference to him. There was no other woman on earth like Jessie, to him, and he knew there never could be. She had come out to where he was at work, late that afternoon, as she often did, and stood watching him draw the long drill and clean the drillings from the hole with a narrow iron spoon. "That's the last hole," said Rip, as he looked up at her. "Pretty soon I'll shoot them, and then I'll have water on my land. And pretty soon after that, you'll be busy on your farm and forget where the water comes from," she said, and there was a wistful note in her voice. "Not in 1,000 years." And Rip's voice trembled. "I've got everything ready to turn the water into Big Bowlegs, but unless," and he stopped. "Unless, what?" murmured Jessie. "Unless I can have you, I don't want any water, don't want any farm. It would mean nothing to me. I'll go back to rambling." He looked into her eyes, and the next instant she was in his arms. The only other work Rip did that day was to take a sledge and cold chisel and break away the stone at the low rim of the basin. This let out enough water to enlarge his silver rope about 100 times. As he went down the gorge, water was gurgling over the stones, and he knew there would be plenty in the great pool by morning, with which to mix his cement and close the fissure. Then he would be ready to turn the stream into his enchanted valley. Then would come wealth, and Jessie. He said nothing of all this to Marshall, but he couldn't help showing his happiness in his beaming countenance. Marshall saw it and attributed it to the buoyant health which his partner had and which he himself could never regain. Marshall had a fiddling fit on him that night. He rarely played, except when he was low-spirited. He hadn't plowed any that day. The fact was, he had had a slight hemorrhage but had said nothing about it. On into the night, the violin poured out its melody, but it was mostly sad, classical compositions. Rip sat in the cabin door, listened and wondered. The sad music had driven the gay mood from his heart. He thought of Jack Bradley, of old Grey Hoss Riley, of Mosby and his apparent intimacy with Marshall. Someone wanted him out of the valley. Who could it be, except Bradley? Why had he kept quiet the last 2 weeks? He wasn't the kind to give up without a fight. Ugly thoughts marched through Rip's mind, like platoons of enemy soldiers. When at last they went to bed, sleep didn't come quickly as usual, and he was restless when he did finally sleep. Rip woke with a start and sat up on his pallet. The moon was shining brightly, and Marshall's pallet was vacant. Rip called to him, and he answered from just outside the door. A moment later, he came in. "I've got a blue spell tonight, Rip," he said. "Been sitting out there on the old wagon tongue, looking at the moon, as I have so often done since you've been in this country. It looks as if one could almost reach the moon and stars. Do you believe in premonitions?" "No," laughed Rip. "Guess my liver's too active for that," and he stretched out on his pallet. The 2 horses had been driven up the gorge, above the spring, and left to graze on the greener grass and weeds they found there. There was a dead stillness over the place, and Rip fell asleep again. It seemed to him that he had slept but a moment when Marshall shook him by the arm. "Wake up, Rip," he whispered. "Listen." In the great stillness, they could hear the hoofs of several horses coming up the valley. "They're coming to drive us out this time," said Marshall, calmly. "And we won't drive worth a darn," snapped Rip, as he drew on his trousers and boots, jackled on his pistol, and sprang for his rifle that stood in the corner. "Will you stay with me, if it comes to a fight, Marshall?" "I'll stay as long as I last, Rip, but I'm afraid I won't be much help. I never was in a gunfight and—" "Hello, in there," called a voice from the outside. "Hello, yourself," returned Rip. "What do you want?" "Come out here." "Can't right now. I'm busy." "State your business, I can hear you." "All right. We come to notify you nesters to get out of this valley. This is a cow country, and we don't aim to have any farmers in it." "Oh, you won't have any farms?" Rip answered. "Well, now you listen to me. There's one little farm on Bowlegs that's going to stay right here. We have a title to the land, from the government, and if you don't get away from here and stay away, somebody'll get hurt." The reply was a volley of shots. Peering out through a crack, Rip had seen 6 mounted men. One of them was old Grey Hoss Riley. The others were strangers. Jack Bradley wasn't with them. As the bullets spattered the cabin wall, 1 or 2 coming through cracks, Rip's rifle spat a streak of flame, and Riley slid from his old gray bag of bones. "Get down and rush them, fellers," called the man who had been the spokesman and seemed to be the leader. "They're just a couple of damn tenderfoots." At the word, Rip and Marshall both began working their guns. Rip was mad, now, and beside himself with rage. "Come on in, damn you," he called out, in a lull of the firing, as he shoved fresh cartridges through the loading gate of his Winchester. "My feet may be tender, but my hands are hard from honest work. I can't shoot much, but I can hit like hell." The gang dismounted and bunched for a rush. 2 streams of fire from the cabin wall poured into them. 2 more of the 6 went down. The other 3 fled toward their horses. Through his lookout, Rip saw 4 more men gallop up to the fray. "Reinforcements. Now we will have it," he growled. Marshall, leaning against the wall, coughed slightly but said nothing. He had said he would stay as long as he lasted, and he was staying. Rip had no time to look at his partner. A funny thing was happening out there in the moonlight. The 4 newcomers had covered the 3 survivors of the battle, and coolly handcuffed them. "Hello, within there," called one. "All right," replied Rip. "What's on your mind? Want a little of the same?" "Not any, thank you," laughed the man. "We're state rangers and tried to catch this gang before they got here. Let's suspend hostilities, and see what you have done to them." At that instant, Rip heard a choking noise from Marshall's corner of the cabin, and turned just in time to see his partner turn loose the wall to which he had been holding and slump to the floor. Rip lit the old battered lantern, and the captain of the ranger squad came in. 1 dead, and 2 hurt bad enough to hold him for a while, on the outside. "What's the casualty list in here?" "My partner's hit," faltered Rip, looking up from where he knelt by the side of Marshall, who was covered with blood. The ranger went over the still form that lay on the floor. "Yes, your partner's hit pretty hard." A moment later he said, "He's dead. I guess that bullet caused his death, but the blood didn't come from his wound." Then, lowering his voice, "He was a lunger, wasn't he?" Rip nodded. "I thought so," continued the ranger. "It's murder, just the same, and will be the finish of this gang. We've been trying to catch them with the goods for a year. It is a regular organized business. They have filed on claims like this all along the foothills. A tenderfoot comes along, some member steers him to one of the claims, telling him it can be bought for a song. He buys it, and then the gang runs him off." By this time, they had walked to the door. In spite of the battle and of Marshall's death, Rip was thinking of another matter. "What about that claim on Little Bowlegs?" he asked. "That," replied the ranger captain, "was another one they used. The land is worthless, but there's plenty of water, and the green settler grabbed it. Fellow by the name of Mosby worked it. They hadn't bumped a sucker for months, and we thought they'd quit. Then a few days ago a man named Bradley came to us with a tale about trading for Mosby's claim and afterward being run ragged until he left it. Then we heard somebody was plowing the claims on Big Bowlegs, and hurried up here." Rip said nothing. He was pretty sure Bradley knew all about the claim on Little Bowlegs, and had intended to bump him with it, but had been caught in his own net. Came morning, and the rangers helped Rip bury his late partner on a bit of rising ground at the edge of the valley. "Now, Mr. Barry," said the ranger captain, "we'll pay you to take your wagon and haul this quiet gent, who was wanted dead or alive, Grey Hoss and the other cripple, and the 3 sound ones, down to headquarters. You can take the team and bring it back," said Rip. "I don't want to leave here just now." "Don't blame you much. We'll send the team back, and also a split out of the reward money." "Just send the team. Don't think I could use any money I got that way," said Rip. It was mid-afternoon. John Marshall's old brown violin lay silent in its case. Rip had looked through the dead man's meager effects. There was nothing but some odds and ends of clothing and a book or two. Nothing to identify him. No former address. From a little bunch of keys found in Marshall's pocket, he fitted one to a leather-bound, trunk-shaped valise and opened it. Here, Rip expected to find papers that would tell whom to notify of his partner's death. What he did find was a single sheet of paper. The last will and testament of John Marshall, dated the day before and written in ink, in a clear hand and scholarly language. It left his wagon and team, his interest in the claims, and all his earthly effects to McRip and Barry. Rip folded it reverently and placed it in his pocketbook for safekeeping. Whoever and whatever Marshall may have been, there was no evidence now. A little heap of paper ashes in the fireplace, evidently made the day before, and unnoticed by Rip until now, bore mute testimony of the man's thoroughness. Rip was thinking sadly, that they had buried him almost before he was cold, when a shadow fell in the cabin door. He started violently, and turned to see the tear-stained face of Jessie Tatum. "Why, what's the matter?" stammered Rip. Father's dead," Jessie sobbed, as she sank to a proffered camp stoolie. Then she sobbed out her story. Old Rance had spells in which he fell and became unconscious. A doctor had told her once it was caused by clots on the brain and that sometime it would kill him. That morning he had fallen, and in spite of all her efforts, the old prospector's spirit had gone to investigate the little pocket in another field. When she had rested a while, Rip took up his pick and shovel and silently led the way up the gorge. There was nothing to say. At least, his tongue was not schooled to say the things that might be said, so he used the true language of sympathy, silence. In a little cove, above the garden, under a juniper tree, Rip made a grave. Then he took up, tenderly, the emaciated body of the broken old prospector, and laid it to its last long sleep. When the last shovelful of earth had been replaced, they returned to the cabin, and sat in the doorway as the sun sank in the west. Jessie told him she had no one to go to, no relatives, no friends. Her mother, who had died when she was 12, had taught her many things, among others, to be a true woman. After her mother's death, she had gone from place to place with her father. The last 4 years, they had lived in this cabin, spending sparingly of the proceeds of the little pocket, of which Rance was always talking. It was about gone now. Their last trip to the little mining town, 30 miles over the range, had almost cleaned it up. "I don't want you to go to anybody else, Jessie," faltered Rip. "But I know, Rip. You're thinking about a preacher, and everything regular, like that. I've been thinking about that, too. We can make a trip down to the settlement and get married regular, so people won't talk." "Another thing, Jessie. When I drilled the holes for those blasts, I didn't think about anything but getting water into Big Bowlegs. If I ever fire them, there won't be a splinter left of your cabin." "That's all right, Rip. I won't need it anymore. I'm going with you. Wait until I put a few things in a bag. We'll get the rest before you fire the blasts." Together they went back down the gorge in the purple dusk. The team came back, and a week later the fissure in the dam was closed. A mighty thunder of blasts shook the mountains, and the waters of Bowlegs Creek changed their course. Little Bowlegs was a dry gorge after that, and Mosby's worthless claim became a barren spot of mountain. Old records of Yavapai County, running back to early territorial days, carried the information that Rip Campbell and Jessie Tatum were duly married on a certain date, approximately that of the Great Blast. Down where Bowlegs once sank into the sand, there is now a great reservoir, and many hundreds of acres of fruit and alfalfa, but Rip's old claim on Big Bowlegs was the pioneer, and still yields its crop of green gold.